Beer. This frosty, cold, and refreshing beverage has wormed its way into the heart of America and is now ingrained in American culture. I love beer, and while sitting around one day watching football, I thought to myself, what's the story behind beer? What's the history of beer? Some quick research via Google came up with some interesting information. Beer dates back to the 6th millennium BC and what is now modern day Iraq. I decided to get some answers from a local expert, Professor Jesse Spunholtz, here at Washington State University.
Monks had been brewing from the Middle Ages as monastic orders became spread across Europe in the Central Middle Ages. Many of those monastic orders began brewing, not particularly because there was any spiritual role for the brewing or the drinking, but because it paid the bills. A lot of monasteries were self-supporting. Nunneries often paid the bills through weaving and knitting and preparing clothes and selling it, and monks earned money through brewing beer. There was nothing it was nothing inherent about monks only brewing beer, though. Most of the beer being drunk in medieval Renaissance Europe was being brewed in houses, not in monasteries at all. Ordinary women would brew most of the beer for most people. Most of the drink that people would drink during the course of the day, is certainly true for peasants, but it was true for most people, was alcoholic. And that was largely a result not of people wanting to be drunk all the time, although I think there's reason to think that people spent more time of their life intoxicated than we do today, but that water was quite often infected. And as any brewer knows, the higher alcohol content you get in a drink, the lower the content of disease. The brewing process was really quite interesting. It's nothing like the brewing process today. The grains through the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, there could be any number of grains that were used for brewing. Barley, wheat, but there might be any mixture of a variety of different kinds of grains. There was no hops used in beer until the 16th century, for the most part. Hops began in Hamburg, but it wasn't spread all across Europe. Instead, women brewsters, the female term for brewers in England in the Middle Ages, women brewsters would go buy what they called grut, which is a mixture of spices and herbs that were used to add to the beer as a preservative to the fermented product. And so they go buy this grut, and towns would have a grut master, someone who's responsible for mixing that town's variety of herbs and spices, which were used as a preservative in the beer. So the woman would get grain, she would malt the grain, and then add water to the grain, and add grut to the grain, and essentially let the wild yeasts in the air ferment the beer. And if you've ever left out a glass of apple cider too long on your table, you know that this will happen around your house. Lots of people who bake bread, for instance, do know the same thing. They can cultivate yeast from the air within the kegs based on that natural wild yeast. But essentially, until the yeast had been cultivated and controlled, most brewing was done this way. So it became what happened in the Renaissance was beer became standardized in a new way. You had a hop plant, and the recipes, rather than a diversity of recipes, you get one kind of plant that ends up with a much more stable product. Beer became standardized, but also it became monopolized by larger and larger brewers who controlled more and more of the industry and shipped it out rather than brewing at home. Well, one result of this is that it's the guilds and the merchant networks who end up taking over the brewing industry. Well, before I said it was monasteries and women in homes that were the largest brewers. These people were cut out of the new capitalist beer markets. these larger and larger companies and breweries got monopolies on hop imports. And tried to shut down local women brewers who were selling for their families and selling extra out the back door, or monasteries. And you start getting really a capitalist brewing system starting in the 16th century as a result of this expansion. In addition, then you also get increasing regulation of the kinds of beer that can be brewed. The German Reinheitsgebot, this is a 16th century German purity beer law, required that only certain grains could be used. Now, only hops and no longer Grut. The Reinheitsgebot was aimed at excluding certain kinds of beer from being produced and only defining it in terms of the large, in this case, Munich brewers, who were dominating the beer industry. So on one hand, it was a German purity law. On the other hand, the women who were operating Grut beer were the ones being excluded from this. So in that sense, brewing and the standardization of brewing and the commercialization of brewing also had a gendered aspect, which I think is kind of an interesting side story that is often not told. The expansion of beer as international product was also the exclusion of home brewing, the exclusion of women, and really a much more diminished role for monastic brewing in ordinary people's drinking.
During the 1800s, Germans immigrated to the United States, bringing with them their brewing culture, where it flourished until 1919, when Prohibition was passed. Prohibition would not be repealed until 1933, and ever since, beer has been unstoppable.